Okay, in this chapter, I'm gonna share some information regarding the attack defense functions in Hailstone NG firewall. Basically, I'm gonna introduce what is ARP defense and how we can use this to defend those ARP attacks. And the second part will be the attack defense, which is the functions that we used to defend for those commonly used attacks like DOS, flooding, scanning, etc. First of all, I'd like to share some information regarding the cyber kill chain. So cyber kill chain, it divided the attack process into seven stages, which will coverage the preparation, the real intrusion process, and also the final active breaching inside of the organization. So by providing the firewall, the traditional firewall, we can help the customer to prevent those attacks in the first few stage, which including the preparation and also the intrusion. And after the NG firewall introduced, which had enhanced with the security capability and also added with some new security features, the NG firewall can do a little bit more, especially during the intrusion part, with the IPS functions, the reputation functions, the sandboxing, etc. And also with help of the malware detecting products, especially those sandboxing product, which will help the customer to identify and detect the malwares and unknown threats during the intrusion part. So what we can also do is using the IPS functions to prevent for those intrusions. Furthermore, by using our intelligent NG firewall, we can also offering the prevention even after the intrusion for post-breach detection and prevention by leverage the AI functionalities using abnormal behavior detection and advanced threat detection, which can help customer to identify the abnormal behaviors and also the unknown threats for the active breach stage. So for the ARP defense, which usually used to defend those ARP attacks by using the ARP technology, including the IP MAC bonding, the ARP authentication, the ARP inspection, DHCP snowing, and also the host-based defense and blacklist. So IP MAC binding is more or less used to bind the specific IP and MAC address. So in this case, we can only allow the binded IP with the mark to access to defend for any other ARP attack. And ARP authentication will help to authenticate for the ARP request. And ARP inspection can be used to inspect for both static and dynamic IP MAC binding. DHCP snowing, which is used to allow the normal address distribution from the DHCP server and also detect the malicious host which are publishing the fake DHCP service in the network. So IP MAC binding, as I mentioned, we support for both static and dynamic binding. So you can manually bind the IP with the MAC address. You can manually bind the IP with the MAC address, or by default, the device already enabled with both ARP learning and also MAC learning, and also dynamic ARP learning. So in this case, the device can also learn the IP MAC binding dynamically. If we want to do some strict control for the IP MAC binding, you'd better to disable the dynamic entry functions by only use the menu binding for the IP and MAC. So you have the option. Customer have the option. And the second one will be the ARP inspection together with the DHCP snowping. So in the network, if all the addresses are distributed through the DHCP server, so you can enable both the ARP inspection and also DHCP snowping functions to prevent against this ARP spoofing attack. In this case, we are able to detect those ARP with the IP MAC binding and also the IP address distributed through the DHCP server that bound with the MAC address, and also prevent for any fake DHCP service. This function supported to be enabled at virtual switch interface and also VLAN interface. And the DHCP snowping functions supported at the virtual switch interface. To ensure the normal DHCP service for the IP distribution. The host defense functions, which is used to send the greatest ARP packets for different hosts. In this case, we can protect against the ARP attacks. As you can see here, it's also supported in virtual switch interface. And you can add the host IP. And MAC address to send the ARP packets for different hosts. And host blacklist. With this function, we can control the user who will not be not allowed to access to internet in some specific period. So this is also the host IP or service block. So you can block based on IP address, or you can block for the service to add them to the blacklist. And second part will be the attack defense. As you know, there are various attacks in the networks, and every day we may facing some new threats like sabotage of the servers, sensitive data thief, some service intervention, or even direct network device sabotage that cause the service anomaly or interruption by using the DOS attacking, flooding, etc. So in this case, we provide the attack defense functions based on the security zone to help the customer to prevent against those attacks, which including the hijacking or spoofing the DOS attack, the commonly used DOS attack, like SYN flood, the UDP flood, etc., and also the protocol exception. Okay, protocol exception, and the scanning attack. So how to configure for the attack defense? So under the network, as I mentioned, network, the attack defense functions available for the zone. So under the zone configuration, there is a threat protection. You can enable the attack defense here. And then you can click config to config the attack defense template. Which including the defense for different types of the attack. For example, for the flooding, you can enable the flood defense for those different flood, like ICMP, UDP, and also set the threshold value for the flood, and then select the action. And TCP protocol, also the well known as the three-way handshake, is used for the TCP connection between the host to the server, and also this connection is through four-way handshake. In somehow, the hackers, they are using the TCP to trigger the half connection attack. In this case, to make the server are not able to respond for any normal TCP request by exhausting the resources of the server using this half connection attack. So the server will not be able to respond to any normal service request. In this case, we can use the SYN proxy function to defend against this SYN flood. Those are half connection flood. So that means all those requests will be proxied by the firewall, and we will respond with the SYN plus with the ACK message on behalf of the server. And we can also change the ACK packet to SYN and send to the server side. We also have the SYN cookie functions, which is used to enhance the SYN proxy functions to save the system resources when surfing the SYN flood attack. And UDP flood, okay, the hacker may use the UDP to sending huge numbers of the UDP packets to attack it within a short period and request for response. And due to the heavy load of the traffic, the server cannot complete the normal transmission task. So in this case, we can set the UDP flood defense by configuring for both source and destination threshold, and also enable with the session state check. And other attacks such as port scan, we can enable the port scan defense. So if over 10 TCP SYN packets sent to different port of one single destination address within the time period, we set it. Within the time period, the threshold we set, the Stonewise will identify them as a port scan, and then we will drop the following packets. We only allow 10 TCP SYN packets to different ports of one single destination. And we also support IP address spoof. So this is the technology that used to gain the unauthorized access to the host. So the hacker may send packets with a forget IP to a computer, and then those packets are distinguished as if they were from a real host to spoof their self as a real host. Okay. So in this case, after the packet enters our firewall, we will query the reverse route for this source IP address. If any IP address spoof attack being detected, we will drop the packet. So those are some commonly used ARP attack function and also attack defense functions. Some questions for this chapter: how many ARP defense methods are supported? As I mentioned before, we support the IP MAC binding, the ARP authentication, ARP inspection, DHCP snowing, the host defense, and also host blacklist. How to configure the whitelist of the attack defense? So for attack defense, when you configure for these functions, you can also configure for the whitelist here. So there's a whitelist. Some common attack defense attacks. As I mentioned before, like UDP flood, SYN flood, the port scan, the UDP flood, etc. So those are the commonly used attacks.